Welcome, dear subscribers and curious listeners of my channel. Lord Voldemort is one of the most recognizable antagonists in global pop culture over the past few decades. His megalomania, cruelty, and obsession with immortality made him the central figure of the Harry Potter story. But fame doesn't equal intelligence or foresight. If you look closely at his actions, you get the impression that the Dark Lord was, let's say, a rather short-sighted villain who destroyed his own plans with his own hands. Today I invite you to go through the choices he made, choices that ultimately led to his downfall. Enjoy watching. Number 1. Choosing to act on the prophecy. Voldemort began hunting Harry purely because of the prophecy saying that a child born at the end of July would have the power to destroy him. He saw himself as so powerful that he had to eliminate the baby at any cost. But by attacking the Potters, he only hastened his own downfall. After the failed murder attempt, he inadvertently transferred part of his power to Harry, making the prophecy come true himself. As Dumbledore later explained, if Voldemort had simply ignored the prediction, it probably would never have come to pass. All he needed to do was back off. But sadly, he lacked that foresight. Number 2. Creating the Horcruxes. The idea of splitting his soul for immortality was logical enough for an obsessed dark wizard. But the execution, instead of hiding Horcruxes in unremarkable objects and sending them somewhere no one would find, the ocean depths or even space, Voldemort chose famous magical relics. Worse yet, he hid them in places Harry and his friends could actually reach. These decisions effectively made the hunt for his soul much easier. Number 3. The misconception about the Elder Wand. After Harry's wand turned his own curse against him, Voldemort decided he needed the perfect wand. Learning about the Elder Wand, he thought it was the key to absolute power. But Voldemort didn't understand that the Elder Wand didn't transfer loyalty simply through killing its previous owner. Believing that killing Snape would make him its true master, he only further complicated the wand's allegiance. In reality, its true master was never him, but Harry. Number 4. Underestimating house elf magic. To protect the Horcrux in the cave, Voldemort forced Kreacher to drink the potion and left him to die. But he completely ignored an important fact. House elf magic can surpass wizard enchantments. Kreacher managed to escape and return to his masters, becoming one of the key links leading Harry to the Horcrux's destruction. Another example of how Voldemort's overconfidence turned into a trap for him. Number 5. Assuming no one knew Hogwarts' secrets. The Dark Lord was so smug he truly believed he alone had uncovered the castle's secrets. He hid Ravenclaw's diadem in the room of requirement, convinced no one would ever suspect it. In reality, hundreds of students over the years had used that room. Even Draco Malfoy and Harry had been there multiple times. When Voldemort found out Harry was destroying Horcruxes, it never even occurred to him to move the diadem somewhere safer. That mistake cost him dearly. Number 6. Choosing to believe Narcissa. When Voldemort believed he had killed Harry in the Forbidden Forest, he asked Narcissa Malfoy to check if the boy was dead. Narcissa used the moment to lie for her son's safety, telling Voldemort Harry was dead. The Dark Lord didn't even consider confirming Harry's death himself. His negligence gave Harry the chance to survive and strike the final blow. Number 7. Entrusting Lucius with the diary. The diary into which Voldemort had placed part of his soul wasn't just a tool for opening the Chamber of Secrets. It was a Horcrux. But when he vanished, he entrusted it to Lucius Malfoy, believing Lucius would guard it as a priceless treasure. Lucius instead used the diary for his own intrigues and ultimately lost it. By the time Voldemort returned, the diary had already been destroyed. This episode perfectly illustrates how poorly he chose the people he trusted. Number 8. Blind faith in absolute control. Voldemort believed that if he controlled everything, nothing could defy him. He seized the Ministry of Magic, thinking it would make all witches and wizards bow. He installed Pious Thickness as a puppet minister and filled every office with his followers. He thought no one would dare resist, but resistance grew faster than ever. Hermione Granger wiped her parents' memories and sent them to Australia. She would not let his regime use them as leverage. "In the Deathly Hallows," she whispered, "it's the only way to keep them safe." Voldemort's reach made her more determined, not weaker. Inside Hogwarts, the same illusion of control failed. He ordered Severus Snape to rule as headmaster. He thought fear would silence the students, but the DA returned in secret. Neville Longbottom, Luna Lovegood, and Ginny Weasley kept the spirit of defiance alive. They carved lightning bolts on walls and passed messages under the Carrows' noses. Voldemort never understood that oppression only sharpened the will to fight. The more he tried to stamp out freedom, the more it burned in hidden corners. He dreamed of a world where every wand answered to him, but he never saw the cost. His obsession with total control broke trust, scattered alliances, and inspired thousands to rise against him. In the final battle, the crowd at Hogwarts was not just fighting to protect a boy, they were fighting to reclaim the right to choose their own lives. Voldemort could conquer buildings, but he could never conquer hearts. Number 9. Attacking Hogwarts without proper preparation. Voldemort attacked Hogwarts in a storm of rage. He had learned that Harry was hunting his Horcruxes. Panic drove him to strike before he lost the last fragments of his soul. He gathered his forces quickly but without discipline. In the Deathly Hallows, he hissed, "I do not want anyone to be spared." But even as he shouted commands, the defenders were already preparing. The teachers raised protective charms. The Order of the Phoenix returned to fight. Every corridor became a trap for his Death Eaters. He failed to gather all his supporters. Many were still scattered, hiding or unsure whether to commit fully. He did not wait to assemble the giants or reinforce his ranks with more Dementors. Instead, he hurled what he had at the castle, believing raw terror would crush resistance. But Hogwarts was not just stone walls. It was loyalty, memory, and unity. Voldemort never imagined students like Neville Longbottom would stand unflinching against him. He never guessed a boy he called Longbottom with disdain would draw the sword of Gryffindor. His attack was not a strategy. It was a furious gamble. He hoped shock would bring victory before dawn, but the defenders held. Every minute that passed, Voldemort's power slipped further away. In the end, the assault he launched to protect his secrets only exposed his desperation. The Dark Lord, who claimed to be invincible, looked no stronger than a cornered predator lashing out in fear. Number 10. Failing to inspire true loyalty. Voldemort ruled by fear. He believed terror was enough to bind people to him forever, but fear does not build loyalty. It only makes followers wait for a safer moment to run. The Malfoy family proved this when everything began to fall apart. In the Deathly Hallows, Lucius Malfoy stood in the Great Hall, pale and shaking. He cared nothing for Voldemort's victory anymore. He cared only for Draco's life. Narcissa and Lucius began searching the crowd, their eyes darting past Voldemort as if he were no more than a shadow. Fear had lost its grip. When Voldemort demanded Bellatrix's help, she obeyed him blindly, but even she was driven more by obsession than loyalty. The rest of the Death Eaters stayed only because they feared death. As soon as the battle turned against them, they began to vanish. Some disapparated without orders, others threw down their wands. In the end, Voldemort was almost alone. His own arrogance blinded him to the truth. No one was ready to die for him. No one believed in his cause. He never understood that respect inspires sacrifice. Dumbledore inspired people to risk everything because they trusted him. Voldemort inspired only terror. That was why his army collapsed when hope returned to Hogwarts. The moment people stopped fearing him, they realized he had nothing else to offer. Voldemort thought fear was unbreakable, but fear was the first thing to shatter when his power slipped. Number 11. Ignoring the power of love and sacrifice. Voldemort called love a foolish sentiment. He could not see it as power. When Lily Potter died to save Harry, she left behind magic older than any curse. Dumbledore tried to make Voldemort understand. In the Order of the Phoenix, he warned, "You cannot despise love without losing something of yourself." Voldemort sneered at this idea. He refused to believe that a mother's sacrifice could protect a child from death itself. But every time he raised his wand, he struck against an invisible shield he could not break. He made the same mistake again with Narcissa Malfoy. When she bent over Harry in the Forbidden Forest, Voldemort thought she was only confirming his victory. He never suspected that a mother's love for her son would make her lie. In that moment, Narcissa whispered, "Is Draco alive? Is he in the castle?" Harry nodded. She turned to Voldemort and said he was dead. Voldemort had no idea he had been deceived by the very emotion he scorned. He believed love could not shape destiny. He was wrong. Snape's devotion to Lily Potter was another truth Voldemort ignored. He thought Snape's feelings were weakness. He never guessed they were the reason Snape protected Harry. When Voldemort killed Snape for the Elder Wand, he still did not understand. Love was the thread binding every act of sacrifice and loyalty against him. Voldemort dismissed it as childish. He never realized it was the only force he could never conquer. Number 12. Underestimating Harry's youth. Voldemort never took Harry's age seriously. He saw only a boy who had survived by accident. He called him the boy who lived with contempt, not curiosity. In the Goblet of Fire, Voldemort sneered, "You have been taught how to duel, I suppose." He mocked Harry's training as childish play. But each year, Harry was learning. Every escape taught him something about courage and sacrifice. Voldemort never paused to wonder whether a child who faced death so many times might grow into a real threat. Instead of ending Harry's life quietly, Voldemort always chose spectacle. He lured him to the graveyard, eager to show the world how he would crush a child. He tied him to a tombstone and gave a speech, savoring the moment. He never saw how that arrogance was shaping Harry's resolve. Even in that moment of terror, Harry thought, "I'm not going to die crouching here like a child." Voldemort thought fear would paralyze Harry, but fear made him brave. Year after year, Voldemort allowed Harry to escape. Each escape became another lesson. When they met in the Forbidden Forest, Voldemort still believed he faced the same boy. He didn't see how much stronger Harry had become. He didn't see that the child he mocked was now a young man ready to die for others. Voldemort never understood that by underestimating Harry's youth, he had given him time to become his executioner. Number 13. Ignoring warnings of betrayal. Voldemort liked to imagine he was too clever to be betrayed. Yet he ignored every warning sign when he chose Quirrell as a vessel. Quirrell was timid and visibly uncomfortable. Even Harry noticed how the professor's hands trembled. In the Sorcerer's Stone, Quirrell admitted, "I was never a match for you, Master." That single line revealed everything. Quirrell was not loyal, he was simply afraid. Voldemort believed fear alone would keep a servant obedient. He never wondered whether that same fear would make a man sloppy, desperate, or easy to expose. He made the same mistake with Peter Pettigrew. Pettigrew had already betrayed the Potters to save himself. He had hidden as a rat for 12 years. That alone should have proved his cowardice. But Voldemort still trusted him with critical tasks, including guarding Bertha Jorkins and helping with his rebirth. In the Goblet of Fire, Wormtail pleaded, "Master, please, let me go to the boy." It was clear he wanted to flee responsibility. Voldemort ignored this. He convinced himself that a frightened servant was easier to control. He never accepted that such a man could ruin any plan the moment it became too dangerous. Again and again, Voldemort surrounded himself with followers who cared more about survival than loyalty. He overlooked every trembling hand and every hesitant voice. He never saw that desperation breeds betrayal. In the end, the cracks he refused to see became the fault lines that split his army apart. The small betrayals he dismissed were the seeds of his greatest defeats. Number 14, failing to learn from past mistakes. Voldemort never learned from his past mistakes. Even after his first downfall, he returned to the same patterns that led to his ruin. He still chose to trust people like Peter Pettigrew, whose cowardice had nearly destroyed everything before. Pettigrew had betrayed James and Lily Potter out of fear, not loyalty. Yet Voldemort welcomed him back with open arms, proving he had learned nothing about the cost of relying on the weak. In the Goblet of Fire, Voldemort sneers, "Wormtail here has paid some of the debt he owes me." He acted as though mere repayment could erase a man's treachery. He also failed to reconsider the power of love, which had defeated him once. Lily Potter's sacrifice had shielded Harry with magic. Voldemort could neither understand nor accept. Instead of respecting this ancient protection, he dismissed it as a fluke. He never studied why the killing curse had rebounded. In the Order of the Phoenix, Dumbledore tells him plainly, "You are incapable of understanding love." Voldemort ignores this warning, believing that fear alone can shape destiny. His arrogance blinded him to the simplest truth. Love is stronger than any curse. After returning to power, he repeated his old strategic mistakes. He underestimated Dumbledore's network, imagining that brute force would topple the Order of the Phoenix. He kept underestimating Hogwarts as a stronghold. Even when the prophecy slipped from his control, he never paused to rethink his obsession with Harry. Again and again he assumed he was invincible. He never admitted that his fixation on killing the boy had doomed him the first time. Voldemort's refusal to learn left a trail of disaster. He surrounded himself with the same cowardly sycophants. He overlooked the same inconvenient truths. He never accepted that his greatest defeats were born not from fate, but from his own choices. When he raised his wand in the final battle, convinced he had outsmarted death itself, he was simply repeating the same old errors. Only this time there was no escape. Number 15, Contempt for Muggles and Muggle-borns. Tom Riddle's earliest memories were already soaked in disdain. He spent his childhood at Wool's orphanage with a silent, simmering rage about the fact that he was different, and not only different, but better. The other children were just ordinary, grubby little things. He could make strange things happen, and he carried that superiority with him into the wizarding world. Once at Hogwarts, he quickly absorbed the ideology of pure-blood supremacy, even though, in a dark irony, he never admitted his own father had been a Muggle. That contradiction alone showed the blindness at the heart of his thinking. The young Tom convinced himself that blood status determined worth, and this certainty became the pillar of his ambitions and later his downfall. His refusal to acknowledge any value in Muggle-born witches and wizards left him vulnerable in ways he could never see. Throughout the rise of Lord Voldemort, this flaw festered and metastasized. He gathered followers who shared or pretended to share his contempt for anyone not of noble, magical lineage. He believed that magic ought to be refined by generations of pure inheritance, as if wizardry was a kind of fine wine, improving only in a single cask. But as he obsessed over lineage, he ignored something elemental: adaptability. Magic itself, at its core, is about transformation. And yet Voldemort believed it was a static inheritance, locked to birthright. This blinded him to the ingenuity and resourcefulness that Muggle-born witches and wizards raised outside the suffocating assumptions of pure-blood tradition brought to the fight against him. Hermione Granger embodied this threat he never took seriously. Though born to Muggle dentists, she possessed an unmatched discipline and an ability to synthesize information from the magical and Muggle worlds alike. It was Hermione who proposed carrying a beaded bag with an undetectable extension charm during the Horcrux hunt, a mundane object transformed into a lifeline. Voldemort never grasped that someone with a Muggle upbringing would imagine such a strategy. His minions were taught to sneer at Muggle trinkets, but Hermione's resourcefulness undermined them again and again. "Are you planning to follow a plan?" Ron once asked her in exasperation. She replied, "Of course, but it helps to have options." That principle was alien to Voldemort's rigid mind. Even in smaller examples, his contempt showed. When Harry, Ron, and Hermione infiltrated the Ministry of Magic under Polyjuice Potion, they exploited the bureaucratic systems and habits of the Muggle world that the Ministry had adopted over centuries. Voldemort had no patience to study such petty mechanisms, but they were exactly what allowed 3 teenagers to break into the heart of wizarding governance undetected. He underestimated the very structures he sought to dominate because he considered them beneath his notice. This arrogance is not just a character flaw, but a strategic failure. Voldemort's inability to understand the ordinary made him vulnerable to ordinary tactics. Dumbledore understood this flaw in Tom Riddle from the start. He tried to teach the boy that love and curiosity were powers far beyond lineage, but Voldemort dismissed every lesson as sentimental weakness. As Dumbledore once observed, "You are not the only one who possesses knowledge, Tom." Yet Voldemort believed that knowledge not derived from old, respected magical families was irrelevant. When Harry retrieved the locket Horcrux from the Ministry, it was not a rare spell or hidden bloodline that helped him. It was the combination of Muggle-born ingenuity and a willingness to observe how people behaved, something Voldemort could never be bothered to learn. The final battle at Hogwarts was not only a clash of wands, but of world-views. While Voldemort surrounded himself with Death Eaters who shared his prejudices, the defenders of Hogwarts drew strength from all quarters: purebloods, half-bloods, Muggle-borns, magical creatures, and even house elves. Creature, whom Voldemort would have regarded as expendable, marched into battle shouting, "Fight for my master!" Voldemort's philosophy could not inspire such loyalty. He was incapable of understanding that community could be formed by respect rather than fear. In the forest clearing where Voldemort ordered Nagini to stay coiled at his side, he imagined himself a conqueror waiting for the formality of Harry's death to cement his supremacy. He could not conceive that Harry might surrender himself willingly, or that such a choice would be rooted in something he scorned: empathy. While he could recite the properties of Elder Wand lore or the genealogy of Salazar Slytherin, he had no language for self-sacrifice. Muggleborns like Lily Potter had taught their children about love in ways Voldemort never understood because he refused to look at the Muggle world as anything but a stain. His failure to grasp that was the most fatal error of all. The story of Severus Snape also demonstrates this blindness. Snape, a half-blood, grew up in a Muggle neighborhood. He had seen the cruelty and mediocrity of ordinary humans and carried bitterness because of it, but he also learned to navigate both worlds. Even in the last hour of his life, Snape possessed a complexity Voldemort never attained. Snape's Muggle-born love, Lily, was the axis around which everything turned. Voldemort's inability to understand why someone would risk everything for the child of a Muggle-born woman revealed a hollowness in his own humanity. When Voldemort killed Lily Potter, he thought he was merely eliminating an obstacle. He never considered that her sacrifice would leave a protection he could not break. Number 16. Lack of a long-term plan. Tom Riddle's earliest memories were already soaked in disdain. He spent his childhood at Wool's orphanage with a silent, simmering rage about the fact that he was different. And not only different, but better. The other children were just ordinary, grubby little things. He could make strange things happen, and he carried that superiority with him into the wizarding world. Once at Hogwarts, he quickly absorbed the ideology of pure-blood supremacy, even though, in a dark irony he never admitted, his own father had been a muggle. That contradiction alone showed the blindness at the heart of his thinking. The young Tom convinced himself that blood status determined worth, and this certainty became the pillar of his ambitions and later his downfall. His refusal to acknowledge any value in muggle-born witches and wizards left him vulnerable in ways he could never see. Throughout the rise of Lord Voldemort, this flaw festered and metastasized. He gathered followers who shared or pretended to share his contempt for anyone not of noble magical lineage. He believed that magic ought to be refined by generations of pure inheritance, as if wizardry was a kind of fine wine, improving only in a single cask. But as he obsessed over lineage, he ignored something elemental: adaptability. Magic itself, at its core, is about transformation. And yet Voldemort believed it was a static inheritance, locked to birthright. This blinded him to the ingenuity and resourcefulness that muggle-born witches and wizards raised outside the suffocating assumptions of pure-blood tradition brought to the fight against him. Hermione Granger embodied this threat he never took seriously. Though born to muggle dentists, she possessed an unmatched discipline and an ability to synthesize information from the magical and muggle worlds alike. It was Hermione who proposed carrying a beaded bag with an undetectable extension charm during the Horcrux hunt, a mundane object transformed into a lifeline. Voldemort never grasped that someone with a muggle upbringing would imagine such a strategy. His minions were taught to sneer at muggle trinkets, but Hermione's resourcefulness undermined them again and again. "Are you planning to follow a plan?" Ron once asked her in exasperation. She replied, "Of course, but it helps to have options." That principle was alien to Voldemort's rigid mind. Even in smaller examples, his contempt showed. When Harry, Ron, and Hermione infiltrated the Ministry of Magic under Polyjuice Potion, they exploited the bureaucratic systems and habits of the Muggle world that the Ministry had adopted over centuries. Voldemort had no patience to study such petty mechanisms. But they were exactly what allowed 3 teenagers to break into the heart of wizarding governance undetected. He underestimated the very structures he sought to dominate because he considered them beneath his notice. This arrogance is not just a character flaw, but a strategic failure. Voldemort's inability to understand the ordinary made him vulnerable to ordinary tactics. Dumbledore understood this flaw in Tom Riddle from the start. He tried to teach the boy that love and curiosity were powers far beyond lineage. But Voldemort dismissed every lesson as sentimental weakness. As Dumbledore once observed, "You are not the only one who possesses knowledge, Tom." Yet Voldemort believed that knowledge not derived from old respected magical families was irrelevant. When Harry retrieved the locket Horcrux from the Ministry, it was not a rare spell or hidden bloodline that helped him. It was the combination of Muggle-born ingenuity and a willingness to observe how people behaved, something Voldemort could never be bothered to learn. The final battle at Hogwarts was not only a clash of wands, but of worldviews. While Voldemort surrounded himself with Death Eaters who shared his prejudices, the defenders of Hogwarts drew strength from all quarters: purebloods, half-bloods, Muggle-borns, magical creatures, and even house elves. Kreacher, whom Voldemort would have regarded as expendable, marched into battle shouting, "Fight for my master!" Voldemort's philosophy could not inspire such loyalty. He was incapable of understanding that community could be formed by respect rather than fear. In the forest clearing where Voldemort ordered Nagini to stay coiled at his side, he imagined himself a conqueror, waiting for the formality of Harry's death to cement his supremacy. He could not conceive that Harry might surrender himself willingly, or that such a choice would be rooted in something he scorned: empathy. While he could recite the properties of Elder Wand lore, or the genealogy of Salazar Slytherin, he had no language for self-sacrifice. Muggle-borns like Lily Potter had taught their children about love in ways Voldemort never understood, because he refused to look at the Muggle world as anything but a stain. His failure to grasp that was the most fatal error of all. The story of Severus Snape also demonstrates this blindness. Snape, a half-blood, grew up in a Muggle neighborhood. He had seen the cruelty and mediocrity of ordinary humans and carried bitterness because of it. But he also learned to navigate both worlds. Even in the last hour of his life, Snape possessed a complexity Voldemort never attained. Snape's Muggle-born love, Lily, was the axis around which everything turned. Voldemort's inability to understand why someone would risk everything for the child of a Muggle-born woman revealed a hollowness in his own humanity. When Voldemort killed Lily Potter, he thought he was merely eliminating an obstacle. He never considered that her sacrifice would leave a protection he could not break. Number 17. Obsession with Slytherin symbols and legacy. Voldemort's obsession with Salazar. Slytherin's legacy was more than a mere preference for the House of Serpents. It was a consuming fixation that governed his every step and ultimately betrayed his lack of foresight. When Tom Riddle first discovered the existence of the Chamber of Secrets beneath Hogwarts, it became an irresistible emblem of his connection to the founder. This secret lair, carved deep under the school by Slytherin himself, seemed to Riddle the perfect testament to his superiority over all others. He believed that his ability to open it with Parseltongue and unleash the basilisk made him the rightful heir. Yet, by so openly aligning himself with Slytherin's legend, he left a trail so obvious that even a boy of 16 like Harry Potter could eventually follow it. Dumbledore, always the master of patterns and significance, understood that Voldemort would never be able to resist the allure of a relic linked to his house. In Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince, Dumbledore told Harry, "You are forgetting he valued his heritage, his lineage." This preoccupation became most visible in Voldemort's decision to create Horcruxes from objects belonging to the founders. The locket of Salazar Slytherin was among the most precious. He went to extraordinary lengths to steal it, believing its lineage made it worthy of containing a piece of his soul. When he entrusted it to the care of Regulus Black's house elf creature, he thought the combination of symbolism and concealment made it invulnerable, but in fact it became a glaring clue. Anyone familiar with Voldemort's reverence for Slytherin would inevitably suspect the locket as something he would never part with lightly. It was this very predictability that let Dumbledore and Harry track the Horcrux to the sea cave, following not just magical traces but the path of Slytherin's mythology. Even his snake, Nagini, was part of this same compulsive pattern. Voldemort's choice to keep her close and eventually turn her into a Horcrux spoke volumes about his inability to think beyond the confines of Slytherin's symbology. To him, a serpent was more than a pet or a tool. It was a living declaration of his descent from the great Salazar himself. This was no coincidence, but a deliberate performance of identity, one he repeated again and again. In Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows, Bathilda Bagshot's desecrated corpse concealed Nagini, proving how Voldemort conflated his symbols with security. Had he been less enthralled by the serpent motif, the Order of the Phoenix might never have guessed that Nagini was anything more than a dangerous familiar. The irony was cruel. In binding himself to Slytherin's legacy, Voldemort created the very vulnerabilities that would end him. He believed that the reverence he held for ancient artifacts made his Horcruxes untouchable, as though age and prestige imparted invincibility. But this faith in the sanctity of relics was more superstition than strategy. Dumbledore recognized that Voldemort's pride was rooted in fear, a terror of mortality that demanded grand gestures to appease. The locket, the cup of Helga Hufflepuff, and the diadem of Rowena Ravenclaw all stood as monuments to a mind trapped in its own mythology. In this way, Voldemort's greatest weakness was not his reliance on dark magic, but his refusal to see beyond his narrow vision of glory. The pattern repeated itself in the very manner he marked Harry. When he chose the lightning-shaped scar, Voldemort unconsciously enshrined himself in yet another symbol, a living reminder of his failure to conquer the prophecy. That scar became the emblem of resistance, a shape as recognizable as any of Slytherin's serpents. In his arrogance, he never imagined that Harry could harness the same symbols against him. When Harry ventured into the Chamber of Secrets to retrieve the basilisk fang that would destroy the Horcruxes, it was Slytherin's legacy that enabled the destruction of Voldemort's own soul fragments. The chamber he had once considered the pinnacle of his power was transformed into the site of his undoing. Voldemort's fixation even infected his recruitment of followers. He surrounded himself with those who would reinforce his illusions, Death Eaters who revered pure-blood heritage and saw Slytherin's traditions as justification for cruelty. Bellatrix Lestrange was an eager participant in this theatre of ancestry, forever praising her master's descent from the noblest house. But such sycophancy blinded them all to the possibility that the symbols they worshipped could be weaponized against them. While they cloaked themselves in the regalia of Slytherin, Dumbledore quietly assembled the clues, and Harry gathered the courage to face them. It is telling that the only Horcrux not directly tied to a founder was the diary. Even then, Voldemort couldn't resist the urge to make it a grand statement, an artifact that would reopen the chamber and repeat the terror he had wrought as a student. When Lucius Malfoy slipped the diary into Ginny Weasley's cauldron, he set in motion a plan so drenched in Slytherin symbolism that it might as well have borne the founder's signature. The basilisk's petrifying rampage was not merely a tactic to kill Muggleborns, but a performance designed to announce the heir's return. Voldemort, too vain to cloak his work in ambiguity, exposed himself long before Harry ever learned to speak Parseltongue. This devotion to heritage shaped Voldemort's early life as Tom Riddle, the lonely orphan who discovered in Slytherin's name a ready-made legend to fill the void of belonging. But as he grew older, the identity he crafted became a prison of expectation. Each decision he made, each Horcrux, each show of serpent imagery reinforced the illusion that power must be draped in the trappings of the past. Dumbledore saw this flaw clearly. He once told Harry that Voldemort was most dangerous to those to whom he showed the least consideration, but he could have added that he was also most vulnerable to those who dared to look past his grandiose performances. Number 18, inability to compromise. The downfall of Lord Voldemort cannot be understood without grasping his obstinate refusal to compromise, a trait that revealed the core of his flawed thinking. In his relentless pursuit of domination, he believed that every negotiation was merely a pause before betrayal. When he returned to power, he viewed alliances as extensions of his own might rather than partnerships with any legitimacy or mutual trust. This attitude poisoned every relationship he touched, eroding the very foundation upon which any lasting power must rest. Even those who might have joined his cause out of fear or ambition soon realized that their loyalty meant nothing to him beyond its temporary usefulness. This is why, when the tide of war turned, so many who once bent the knee to the Dark Lord did not hesitate to abandon him. Voldemort's blindness to compromise first became unmistakable during his campaign to infiltrate the Ministry of Magic. He had ample opportunities to work with influential wizards like Rufus Scrimgeour, who might have been pressured or manipulated into a peace that legitimized his authority. But Voldemort refused even to consider negotiation. Instead, he relied on subterfuge and intimidation alone, as though the Ministry's capitulation could be achieved only by fear. When the final takeover came, it was not a true victory of persuasion, but a temporary seizure of institutions already hollowed out by terror. His regime never inspired confidence or stability because it was not built on any shared vision or consent. In the end, it was simply a puppet show, propped up by threats and the cowardice of those too frightened to resist. This failure to compromise infected even his personal dealings with the Death Eaters. Severus Snape, for example, offered counsel that could have saved Voldemort from multiple strategic blunders. Snape understood nuance, subtlety, and the value of patience, but Voldemort distrusted any opinion that hinted at caution or alternative perspectives. When Snape tried to warn him that killing Harry Potter might be more complicated than he believed, Voldemort dismissed these concerns with cold arrogance. "I have performed my usual magic," he insisted, as though his infallibility were self-evident. The result was the catastrophe in the Forbidden Forest, where the killing curse backfired because he could not acknowledge any wisdom but his own. Bellatrix Lestrange demonstrated an equally blind devotion to Voldemort's uncompromising will. She served as an extension of his contempt for negotiation. Her zealous violence at the Department of Mysteries destroyed any chance to manipulate the prophecy keepers through fear and persuasion. Instead of using the captured Order members as leverage or bargaining chips, Bellatrix acted on Voldemort's implicit belief that only annihilation mattered. "The Dark Lord always knows," she hissed in the Hall of Prophecy, but this certainty was a delusion. By scorning the idea of making terms or buying time, Voldemort ensured the Order would remain united against him to the bitter end. Voldemort's contempt for compromise extended beyond his enemies and even his followers to the very structure of magical society. The wizarding families he despised, especially the Weasleys and the Longbottoms, might have been tempted by offers of protection or limited autonomy if he had been willing to bargain. Instead, he branded them traitors and hunted them without quarter. His proclamations left no room for neutrality or even grudging compliance. Either a wizard declared absolute allegiance, or they became a target. This rigid division only strengthened Dumbledore's coalition. Ordinary witches and wizards who might otherwise have preferred to stay out of the conflict eventually chose to resist Voldemort simply because he offered them no alternative. His inability to understand or respect compromise also crippled his most pivotal moment, the attempt to subdue Hogwarts. The castle was not merely a fortress, it was the heart of the magical world's cultural identity. Any effort to occupy it successfully would have required delicate alliances with key figures inside. Instead, Voldemort demanded total surrender and threatened annihilation. When he sent his ultimatum into the Great Hall, it read, "You have fought valiantly. Lord Voldemort knows how to value bravery, yet you have sustained heavy losses. If you do not hand over Harry Potter by midnight, the battle will be renewed, and everyone within this castle will be killed." The threat was absolute, leaving no path to reconciliation. In that moment, even wizards who feared him most resolved to stand against him. One of the most illustrative examples of Voldemort's contempt for compromise came during his resurrection ritual. Peter Pettigrew had already risked everything to bring him back, yet Voldemort repaid that loyalty with scorn. When he used Pettigrew's flesh in the potion that restored his body, he reduced his servant to a mere expendable tool. "Wormtail, you return to me," he sneered. It was not gratitude, but a cold declaration of ownership. Had Voldemort treated Pettigrew as a true ally, offering him even the smallest share of respect, he might have secured a more reliable servant. Instead, Pettigrew's fear and resentment festered, leaving him ready to falter when loyalty was most needed. Throughout the entire war, Voldemort never recognized that coalition building is the essence of victory. He believed that terror alone would suffice. The Order of the Phoenix, by contrast, drew strength from bonds of trust and the ability to disagree without shattering their cause. Lupin and Sirius, Molly and Arthur, even Snape and Dumbledore, these were relationships forged by compromise, negotiation, an understanding. Voldemort dismissed such connections as weakness, unable to comprehend that unity founded on respect is stronger than fear. This blindness was not merely tactical, it was existential. In scorning compromise, he stripped himself of the humanity necessary to understand why others fought so hard to resist him. Even the giants and werewolves, whom Voldemort recruited as shock troops, were never true allies. He offered them no stake in the new world he claimed to be building. They followed him only because he promised violence and the right to plunder. Once it became clear that defeat was possible, they deserted him without hesitation. Voldemort had mistaken their opportunism for loyalty because he could not imagine any bond but dominance. His vision of conquest contained no place for cooperation, no role for negotiation, no room for genuine alliance. The irony was that Voldemort's own fear of death might have been alleviated if he had learned to compromise with the simple reality that no wizard can escape mortality forever. Instead, he split his soul into fragments, a gesture of ultimate refusal to accept any limit or shared truth. In his desperation to deny human vulnerability, he forfeited the very qualities that make life worth defending. His Horcruxes were monuments to his inability to reconcile himself to any compromise, even with nature itself. When the final battle commenced, Voldemort's strategic rigidity left him isolated. He stalked the Hogwarts grounds like a solitary predator, relying only on Nagini and the illusion of invincibility. His army, exhausted and disillusioned, no longer believed in the inevitability of his triumph. Many Death Eaters began to flee, recognizing that Voldemort would offer no clemency, no negotiated surrender, no path to redemption. As Neville Longbottom stepped forward to defy him, the crowd surged with new courage precisely because Voldemort had made no effort to divide them with promises or bargains. In his contempt for compromise, he unified his enemies beyond all hope of fracture. There is no more telling proof of this flaw than the way Voldemort treated Draco Malfoy. The Malfoy family, once powerful allies, were ultimately alienated by his relentless cruelty. By forcing Draco to attempt Dumbledore's murder and later punishing Lucius for every perceived failure, Voldemort demonstrated that no amount of loyalty would ever earn his trust or mercy. Narcissa Malfoy's quiet decision to lie to him in the Forbidden Forest, claiming Harry was dead, was the final act of a woman whose family had been driven past the point of loyalty. Had Voldemort shown them even a shred of respect or offered a compromise to protect Draco, the Malfoys might never have betrayed him. Instead, his insistence on absolute submission created enemies in the very house that once bore his mark. This ultimately was the most fatal consequence of Voldemort's inability to compromise. He could not imagine a world in which other people's choices mattered. He believed that fear was enough, that terror was the only lever needed to bend wizards to his will. But fear can be outlasted, hatred can be outlived. The moment the Dark Lord lost his aura of inevitability, he became just another tyrant, alone in his delusions of supremacy. It was not merely a strategic miscalculation, it was a revelation of the hollowness at the core of his ambition. Without compromise, no lasting empire can ever endure. Number 19. Overestimating his own invulnerability. Lord Voldemort built his entire existence on the assumption that he could not be defeated, that death itself would be forever held at bay by his cunning and the dark magic he commanded. He was convinced that every possible threat to his supremacy could be crushed by sheer power or intimidated into silence. When Tom Riddle became the Dark Lord, he consciously abandoned the notion that ordinary rules applied to him, and this arrogance festered into a fatal blind spot. The seeds of this flaw were already present during his days at Hogwarts. Albus Dumbledore once observed his obsession with his own exceptionalism, remarking in Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince, "Lord Voldemort has never had a friend, nor do I believe that he has ever wanted one." The absence of any real connection meant that Voldemort never developed the humility that comes from admitting one might be vulnerable. He mistook fear for respect, silence for loyalty, and terror for indestructibility. The creation of Horcruxes was the most obvious manifestation of this conceit. Splitting his soul again and again, he imagined that no weapon, no curse, and no opponent could truly end him. This was a staggering miscalculation that showcased how Voldemort believed his own legend more than he believed in any evidence or logic. He declared himself immortal without recognizing that each fragment of soul was also a liability. Every Horcrux was a crack in his armor, a visible sign of his desperation to outwit death, and yet he regarded them as unassailable. When he murdered Bertha Jorkins and concealed her death in Albania, he was so convinced of his invulnerability that he did not consider how information might leak or how his trail of destruction would eventually be uncovered by those determined enough to look. The night he returned to his full strength in the graveyard at Little Hangleton, Voldemort stood before the gathered Death Eaters and proclaimed, "I, who have gone further than anybody along the path that leads to immortality." This declaration was not just a statement of fact, but a boast saturated with pride. It revealed that he had become addicted to the idea that he alone possessed secrets too profound to be comprehended by lesser wizards. But such conviction blinded him to the reality that even the most ingenious schemes could unravel. The very ritual that restored his body required the blood of Harry Potter, a boy Voldemort had repeatedly underestimated. In taking that blood, Voldemort unknowingly tethered himself to Harry's life, creating a loophole in his own protections. He never imagined that his own actions could be used against him because he refused to believe he could be outwitted. His confidence grew so absolute that he even ignored the warnings of Severus Snape, who attempted to caution him that killing Dumbledore would only rally Harry and the Order of the Phoenix. Voldemort treated every counsel as an insult to his omniscience. Snape's words fell on deaf ears because Voldemort had become incapable of acknowledging that anyone could possess insight he lacked. When Dumbledore was finally struck down atop the astronomy tower, Voldemort regarded it as the triumphant elimination of the only wizard he had ever feared. Yet he failed to consider how Dumbledore's sacrifice would galvanize the opposition and inspire loyalty beyond fear. It never occurred to Voldemort that removing the headmaster would not break Hogwarts' spirit, but instead steel it against him. Perhaps the clearest evidence of his hubris was the moment he invaded the Ministry of Magic. He had convinced himself that the Elder Wand was the final instrument to secure his supremacy, and he believed no one else possessed the nerve to defy him openly. Even as he duelled Professor McGonagall, Kingsley Shacklebolt, and Horace Slughorn in the Great Hall, he maintained an air of cold certainty. He was certain that no alliance of wizards, no matter how brave, could withstand his wrath. But, in that same instant, Neville Longbottom drew the sword of Gryffindor from the sorting hat and severed Nagini's head. The final Horcrux was destroyed by a boy Voldemort had never thought worthy of a second thought. His reliance on the myth of his own invincibility meant he never anticipated that an ordinary student could deal a mortal blow. Even before this climax, Voldemort's overestimation of his power had exposed him to danger. In Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows, he searched obsessively for the Elder Wand, convinced that possessing it would make him unbeatable. He desecrated Dumbledore's tomb in the middle of the night, a gesture that demonstrated not just audacity, but profound recklessness. He could not fathom that the wand's loyalty would not transfer merely by theft. His inability to grasp the true nature of mastery, how power required understanding as well as brute force, revealed how shallow his perception had become. He relied on symbols and relics to confirm his supremacy, believing that ownership alone conferred destiny. His disdain for love and sacrifice sealed this blindness. He had always scorned Lily Potter's protection of her son, calling it weak and sentimental. But it was precisely this protection that rendered Harry immune to Voldemort's killing curse on the night he regained his body. When he cast Avada Kedavra in the Forbidden Forest, Voldemort believed he was delivering a final, effortless triumph. He failed to realize that the Elder Wand could not kill its true master. Harry later reflected that Voldemort had killed the piece of his own soul inside Harry, illustrating the bitter irony that his invincible magic had undone him again. He could not comprehend that love could create bonds more powerful than fear, because his entire life had been shaped by contempt for any feeling he deemed ordinary. His inner circle saw the cracks long before he did. Bellatrix Lestrange, perhaps the most fanatical of his followers, once trembled when Voldemort's plans showed any sign of faltering, but even she occasionally cast anxious glances when he dismissed reports of Harry's progress. His Death Eaters had learned never to question his proclamations, yet their silent dread hinted at the unspoken truth. They all depended on the illusion that their master could not be defeated. Voldemort's refusal to contemplate failure meant he never established contingency plans beyond brute retaliation. If a Horcrux fell, he simply hunted whoever was responsible, never pausing to question whether his soul's division was itself a vulnerability that deserved caution rather than pride. At Malfoy Manor, when Harry, Ron, and Hermione were captured, Voldemort was absent because he was hunting the Elder Wand. His single-minded quest left his prisoners to be guarded by others. If he had been present, he might have prevented their escape and the theft of Griphook's help to enter Gringotts. But he had grown so sure of his supremacy that he regarded any task not personally glorifying as beneath him. Even when he sensed that another Horcrux was threatened, the cup hidden in Bellatrix's vault, he reacted too late because he had convinced himself that no one could discover the secret. This delayed response cost him another fragment of his soul. When Harry finally confronted him in the Great Hall, Voldemort stood in front of the assembled students and staff and offered them a single opportunity to surrender. This was not a tactic born of strategic wisdom, but a performance of invincibility. He raised his voice so that every corner of the castle would hear him declare that resistance was futile. But as Harry advanced, unarmed, to face him, Voldemort still could not imagine that the boy could survive a direct assault. He sneered in contempt because he believed Harry was walking into death. In that final instant, Voldemort's certainty was so absolute that he never realized. His own end was seconds away. His final downfall came not from any superior spell or stronger wand, but from the consequences of his own mistakes. The Elder Wand, stolen but never truly won, refused to kill its master's master. The last curse rebounded, ending the life of the wizard who had once believed he had transcended mortality. He lay lifeless in the same hall where he had declared himself immortal. Every person who had feared his name bore witness to the ultimate irony. The man who insisted he could not be killed died because he never allowed himself to imagine that he could. Voldemort's story is a cautionary tale of what happens when belief in one's legend becomes more important than truth. He taught himself to despise doubt and humility, scorning any reminder that power alone does not guarantee wisdom. The boy who feared death above all else became the man who doomed himself by denying he could ever meet it. In the end, it was not Harry Potter's wand, nor Dumbledore's strategy, nor the Order's courage that defeated him outright. It was the fatal flaw Voldemort nurtured with every choice, the conviction that he was untouchable. Number 20. Neglecting ancient magic beyond his interests. Voldemort's downfall was not solely the consequence of hubris or the overconfidence that bloomed with each victory he seized. It was, more precisely, the result of his deliberate refusal to broaden his understanding of the older currents of magic that flowed beneath the surface of wizarding history. He was fascinated, enslaved even, by a singular vision to split his soul, conquer death, and dominate all opposition. In that relentless quest, he overlooked domains of ancient magic that Albus Dumbledore not only respected, but studied with the humility of a true scholar. The Dark Lord's preoccupation with Horcruxes and unforgivable curses left him shockingly unprepared for the subtle, resilient forces that ultimately checked his power. He believed that because a curse was dark, it was the apex of strength, yet there were older enchantments he dismissed as sentimental or irrelevant, and in doing so he revealed a fatal short-sightedness. Consider the night he marked Harry Potter as his equal. Voldemort thought himself invincible behind the Elder Wand, a relic he claimed as a mere instrument of supremacy. He never imagined that Lily Potter's sacrifice, a simple, unassuming act of love, could forge an invisible shield more enduring than any unforgivable curse he had mastered. In Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, Dumbledore later explained, "To have been loved so deeply, even though the person who loved us is gone, will give us some protection forever." Voldemort sneered at such explanations. For him, love was a trifling emotion, unworthy of study or respect. He never consulted the old texts that described how love was woven into the warp and weft of protective magic. Nor did he care to learn why generations of witches and wizards revered the ancient wards set by bonds of sacrifice. While Voldemort experimented with splitting his soul, Dumbledore pored over manuscripts detailing blood wards, life debts, and protective oaths, subjects Voldemort spurned as the naive superstition of the weak. His arrogance blinded him to the fact that the roots of magic stretched back through centuries of ritual and covenant. When he performed the ritual to regain his body in Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire, he chose to craft his new flesh from Harry's blood, believing that this would strip away any trace of the old protection. But the ritual did not break the ancient magic. It bound Harry's life to his own in ways he never anticipated. Voldemort's ignorance of such old principles was not an accidental oversight. It was the willful narrowing of vision that came with obsession. Dumbledore, by contrast, spent decades investigating the nature of magic that was neither purely defensive nor offensive, but transformative, magic that blurred the line between charm and curse, hex and healing. In The Half-Blood Prince, he told Harry that his most powerful weapons against Voldemort were not wands or spells, but the power he knows not. This was no metaphor. Dumbledore had read accounts of rituals conducted by the Druids to sanctify places and people, protections woven so deep into the land that no curse could ever fully penetrate. Voldemort thought such practices were relics of a primitive age and discounted them entirely. It is no coincidence that Voldemort's final failure came in the shape of the Elder Wand, an artifact steeped in legend, saturated in the oldest magic of allegiance and mastery. He thought the wand was a blunt instrument of power, one that responded only to strength and violence, but the wand itself was governed by ancient laws of ownership and loyalty that no amount of dark magic could circumvent. As Dumbledore recorded in his notes, the Elder Wand will only serve a master who has won it by force or cunning, but never by fear alone. Voldemort's understanding of power did not extend to such subtleties, for he had never studied the intricate rituals that determined wand allegiance. Even in the matter of Horcruxes, his chosen path to immortality, Voldemort's knowledge was partial. He had discovered a way to fracture his soul, but had little curiosity about the broader laws surrounding the soul's integrity and its healing. There were accounts buried in the Department of Mysteries describing how certain rites could knit together even a fragmented spirit, but Voldemort never investigated them. He could not conceive of needing such knowledge. In this way, he neglected the possibility that others might use restorative magic against him, a blindness that proved catastrophic when Harry entered the Forbidden Forest to sacrifice himself. When the killing curse rebounded yet again, Voldemort stood in the rubble of his illusions, undone not by superior curses, but by his refusal to comprehend any force outside his narrow interests. He had dismissed the very ideas that would later define his destruction: love, sacrifice, loyalty. These were not just moral concepts, they were strands of ancient magical law as old as wizardkind itself. In Deathly Hallows, Dumbledore's portrait remarked, "Perhaps those who are best suited to power are those who have never sought it." The sentiment infuriated Voldemort precisely because he had never understood that power could arise from something other than conquest. It is revealing that even Grindelwald, who shared Voldemort's ruthlessness, displayed a broader appetite for knowledge. Grindelwald studied the Hallows as much for their mythological importance as for their tactical potential. Voldemort never paused to consider why the Hallows had endured in legend, dismissing them as fairy tales until the Elder Wand's rumoured existence tempted him. His ignorance of the other Hallows, the Resurrection Stone and the Invisibility Cloak, was not just lack of curiosity but evidence of a mind incapable of seeing value in anything that did not serve his singular obsession. Dumbledore, meanwhile, had recognized the cloak's unparalleled enchantments and even identified its origin in the Peverell family. Voldemort could not be bothered to reflect on the Peverell legacy beyond acquiring the wand. He knew of Antioch Peverell, but never considered Ignotus's cloak or Cadmus's stone as worthy of his attention. The irony is that if he had taken the time to understand the complete legend, he might have anticipated the hidden protections that shielded Harry, and perhaps even realized that the line between life and death was more complex than his crude manipulations of mortality. Throughout the series, Voldemort's narrowness becomes a refrain. He could brew the most complex potions of regeneration, but had no patience for healing charms. He could curse a victim into perpetual agony, but never learned the spells to mend broken bonds. He scorned the old marriage rites and blood pacts that united magical families across centuries. He regarded magical treaties, such as those invoked to protect Hogwarts itself, as bureaucratic trivia. It never occurred to him that such ancient accords were sealed with oaths whose magical force could resist even his greatest efforts. Even his most loyal followers, like Bellatrix Lestrange, displayed more curiosity about the nuances of old magic than he did. Bellatrix showed fascination with the sword of Gryffindor, an object imbued with goblin craftsmanship and ancient enchantments of worthiness. Voldemort regarded the sword as a trinket and failed to understand how it might be used to destroy his Horcruxes. When Hermione retrieved the sword from the lake in Deathly Hallows, it was not only her bravery, but her respect for magical tradition that made the weapon reveal itself. Voldemort never grasped that the sword's refusal to serve him was rooted in magic, older and purer than any he wielded. His contempt for these traditions extended to magical creatures as well. Dumbledore made alliances with the centaurs, the goblins, and even the merfolk, respecting their ancient claims and customs. Voldemort saw them as pawns, never worth negotiating with. This failure left him isolated, deprived of allies who might have warned him or offered crucial insight into the rituals he disdained. When the goblins stole the sword of Gryffindor from Bellatrix's vault, Voldemort's ignorance of goblin lore, particularly their understanding of ownership, meant he did not anticipate the theft or grasp its consequences. Perhaps nowhere was his blindness more pronounced than in his understanding of magical blood. He was obsessed with pure blood supremacy, but never studied the ancient treaties concerning blood protection. Lily Potter's sacrifice invoked a blood bond older than any dark incantation. Dumbledore arranged for Harry to live with Petunia Dursley precisely because her blood maintained that protection. Voldemort never read the old treatises describing how such a bond could be renewed annually simply by Harry calling that house home. He believed brute force could overcome all. But the old magic, born of love and sealed in blood, required no wand to sustain it. Again and again, Voldemort's downfall was a tale of knowledge refused. The same mind that could conceive the intricacies of soul-splitting could not conceive the possibility that knowledge itself was power, especially knowledge outside his obsessions. While he perfected the arts of death, Dumbledore mastered the arts of life, the rituals of union, the wards of protection. When Harry walked into the forest to offer himself as a sacrifice, Voldemort believed he had finally triumphed. But in truth, he had only demonstrated his most enduring flaw. the belief that the only magic worth knowing was the magic he already understood. Number 21, ignoring loyalty in enemy alliances. Voldemort's greatest failing was not his cruelty nor even his lust for power, but his inability to grasp the nature of loyalty. When he sought to conquer the wizarding world, he imagined that people could be broken and rebuilt in his image by fear alone. He never understood that the true strength of Dumbledore's Order of the Phoenix was not its magic or numbers, but the stubborn, unbreakable ties of trust and friendship that bound its members. In his arrogance, Voldemort assumed that loyalty was transactional, given for reward or withheld out of fear. He thought terror was enough to secure obedience, but it was precisely that reliance on intimidation that doomed his cause. The Order did not obey Dumbledore out of fear, but because they believed in him, and more importantly, they believed in one another. Consider the way the Order regrouped after the fall of the Ministry, when Voldemort installed Pious Thickness as his puppet. While the Death Eaters strutted about in new authority, raiding homes and rounding up Muggle-borns, the Order vanished underground, but it did not dissolve. At Grimmauld Place, even as the Fidelius charm was compromised, they worked with unflinching coordination. Lupin risked his life to report Voldemort's movements. Kingsley Shacklebolt infiltrated the Ministry to provide intelligence. Arthur and Molly Weasley, even while protecting their family, sheltered fugitives and spread warnings. They had no reason to trust each other, except the conviction that their cause was just and that their friends would not betray them. Voldemort's mistake was thinking this could be broken as easily as he broke the will of his followers. He was skilled at domination, using the Cruciatus Curse or the threat of death to force loyalty. Bellatrix Lestrange's insane devotion suited him because it was rooted in fear and the thrill of violence, not in any genuine principle. By contrast, when the Order faced fear, it did not disintegrate. Even as Voldemort's name became taboo and snatchers roamed the country, the Weasley twins continued their subversive jokes on Potterwatch. The only radio program that doesn't tell you you're lying if you say, "You know who," as Fred said. This small act of defiance was no less important than any duel because it held the network of trust together. It is telling that Voldemort never even tried to understand why people followed Dumbledore. To him, Dumbledore's refusal to use fear was weakness, but Dumbledore's real power was that he inspired love and loyalty so strong that people would risk anything for it. Severus Snape, for all his moral ambiguity, exemplifies this. Though Voldemort trusted Snape as a skilled legilimens and master spy, he never guessed that Snape's true loyalty was to Lily Potter's memory. Snape's entire double life was built on Voldemort's refusal to consider that anyone could act out of love for another. As Snape said bitterly to Dumbledore, "You know how and why she died. Make sure it was not in vain." Voldemort's blindness to such motives gave Snape room to maneuver right under his nose. Harry's survival itself was built on this misunderstanding. Voldemort tried to use fear to coerce loyalty even from his closest followers, as shown when he murdered Charity Burbage in front of them at Malfoy Manor. The terror in the room was palpable, but no genuine loyalty resulted. Even the Malfoys eventually abandoned him when it meant protecting Draco. Narcissa's whisper to Harry in the Forbidden Forest, "Is Draco alive? Is he in the castle?" And her subsequent lie to Voldemort about Harry's death was an act of maternal loyalty that Voldemort's entire philosophy could not anticipate. He believed loyalty ended at the edge of a wand. He also underestimated the network of personal ties that let the Order keep fighting after Dumbledore's death. Voldemort assumed that killing Dumbledore would leave the Order leaderless and demoralized. Instead, the members responded with grim determination. McGonagall took command at Hogwarts, organizing resistance. Neville Longbottom, once a shy, stuttering boy, led the renewed Dumbledore's army in secret. "We were all in it together," Neville later explained to Harry. That sense of togetherness was exactly what Voldemort could not destroy because he didn't even see it. His Death Eaters fought for power or out of fear. The Order fought for each other. In the final battle at Hogwarts, this difference became stark. Voldemort offered mercy to anyone who would turn Harry over. He gave his followers permission to kill indiscriminately. But in the Great Hall, the defenders stood side by side, house elves, centaurs, Hogwarts teachers, parents and students alike. When Voldemort shouted, "There is no good and evil, there is only power, and those too weak to seek it," he was declaring the worldview that made him blind. He couldn't comprehend that for most people, power was less important than love, friendship, or duty. That failure wasn't tactical, it was moral and intellectual. It meant he couldn't predict the choices people would make. Even the way Voldemort treated his followers revealed this flaw. He used them as tools. Peter Pettigrew, who owed his life to Voldemort, died at his own silver hand for a moment of mercy. Bellatrix, for all her loyalty, was driven by bloodlust and fear. Voldemort never cultivated real loyalty because he didn't want equals. Contrast that with the way the Order worked, with members like Molly Weasley who killed Bellatrix not for glory, but to protect her daughter, screaming, "Not my daughter, you bitch!" That was the kind of loyalty Voldemort couldn't buy or threaten out of anyone. His ignorance of these bonds meant he missed opportunities to sow real division among his enemies. He tried to tempt people with power, like offering Draco Malfoy the task of killing Dumbledore, but failed to consider that the task itself would traumatize Draco and alienate the Malfoys. He tried to turn Snape's love into an asset without realizing that very love made Snape his enemy. He relied on spies like Yaxley in the Ministry, but never built the kind of mutual trust that would make people volunteer the truth. Even among the Death Eaters, suspicions and rivalries flourished. Lucius Malfoy fell out of favor. The Lestranges mocked the Malfoys for their cowardice, and none of them dared tell Voldemort anything he didn't want to hear. This failure of understanding was so complete that even in his final moments, Voldemort did not see it. When Harry met him in the forest ready to die, Voldemort believed he had won. But Harry's willingness to sacrifice himself was something Voldemort never expected. As Dumbledore explained later, by returning, you may ensure that fewer souls are maimed, fewer families are torn apart. Voldemort could not comprehend such logic. To him, life was power and fear. He couldn't imagine giving it up to protect others. That act of love made Harry the master of the Elder Wand, sealing Voldemort's fate. The Elder Wand itself is the perfect symbol of Voldemort's blindness. He wanted it because it was the most powerful wand in the world, never understanding that mastery over it depended on more than brute force. Dumbledore won it by defeating Grindelwald, who had once been his friend. Harry won its allegiance not by killing, but by disarming Draco, who was himself an unwilling participant in Voldemort's plans. The wand responded to subtlety, to the quiet shift of loyalty rather than open violence. Voldemort's killing curse, rebounding on himself, was the ultimate proof that power divorced from understanding is self-destructive. Throughout the war, Voldemort also underestimated the power of shared memory and loss. When Fred Weasley died, the Order did not splinter in despair. Instead, his family and friends fought harder. Voldemort thought fear would break their spirit, but grief and rage only solidified their resolve. Similarly, after Dobby's death, Harry insisted on giving him a proper burial. Ron and Hermione helped dig the grave by hand. This act of love and respect bound them closer together at a time when everything else was falling apart. Such gestures were meaningless to Voldemort, who thought fear alone could hold people in line. In many ways, Voldemort was a master strategist in the short term, but a catastrophic planner. In the long term, he could terrorize, but he could not inspire. He could kill, but he could not win hearts. He understood the mechanics of conquest, but not the foundations of rule. By failing to appreciate how trust and love can bind people more tightly than any magical vow, he left himself vulnerable to the very things he mocked. As Dumbledore once told Harry, "Do not pity the dead, Harry, pity the living, and above all, those who live without love." Voldemort did not just live without love, he dismissed it as weakness, and that blindness doomed him. This shortcoming also explains why Voldemort's propaganda failed to sway the majority of the wizarding world. While he controlled the Daily Prophet and forced the Ministry to parrot his lies, underground networks spread the truth. Potterwatch broadcast real news. Graffiti in Diagon Alley mocked the regime. Hogwarts students organized sabotage. In every corner of the country, ordinary people risked imprisonment or death to help fugitives. Voldemort could not root out such resistance because it wasn't centrally controlled. It was a web of loyalty and shared conviction, impossible to terrorize into silence. Even after Voldemort's death, this lesson remained vital. The wizarding world had to reckon with the truth that fear cannot build a lasting order. Kingsley Shacklebolt, as the new Minister for Magic, made it his priority to restore trust between the Ministry and the public. Trials were held not merely for revenge, but to establish accountability. People like Harry, Ron, and Hermione worked to dismantle the prejudice Voldemort exploited. The friendships forged in war became the foundation of peace. Voldemort had tried to rule by breaking these bonds. In the end, those bonds were what defeated him. Number 22, relying on fear over persuasion. Voldemort's relentless pursuit of domination was shaped by a single, catastrophic flaw. He never learned the art of winning hearts. He wielded fear as his primary tool, imagining it to be the strongest of glues, while in truth it was the weakest. His obsession with terror over persuasion led to the same pattern repeating itself again and again, servants who did not love him but obeyed only out of dread. The ranks of the Death Eaters were not united by conviction, only the mutual knowledge that any hint of betrayal would be answered with agony or death. Bellatrix Lestrange, perhaps his most fanatical supporter, was in her way a reflection of Voldemort's own twisted understanding of loyalty, a love mingled with terror, an addiction to violence that left no room for reasoned devotion. Even she acted not from true belief in a better world, but from her worship of the Dark Lord's power and the thrill of cruelty. No cause binds people more strongly than an idea that inspires them, but Voldemort offered nothing but the promise of others' suffering. Throughout the saga, one sees this difference laid bare in moments of crisis. When Voldemort returned in the graveyard, he summoned the Death Eaters with the touch of Wormtail's dark mark, demanding their presence with a tone of lethal contempt. He greeted them by berating them for their absence and disloyalty, saying, "Yet you ran from my mark when you felt it burn. You fled, and now you crawl back to me, hoping for forgiveness." There was no attempt to understand their motives, no acknowledgement that for over a decade they had faced imprisonment and disgrace. Instead, he humiliated them publicly, cementing their terror, but also guaranteeing that they would never stand with him from principle or conviction. Fear cannot inspire the sacrifices that true belief can, and Voldemort was too arrogant to see this. The Malfoys provide perhaps the clearest example of this failure. Lucius Malfoy began as a proud Death Eater, basking in the influence Voldemort's name carried. But when Voldemort rose again, Lucius's initial eagerness gave way to desperation. After the debacle at the Department of Mysteries, Voldemort held Lucius personally responsible, sending him to Azkaban without a moment's hesitation. Narcissa Malfoy, compelled to play the role of the obedient wife and mother, knew that her family's safety depended on submission. And yet, in the end, when given a chance to protect Draco, she lied to Voldemort's face, claiming that Harry was dead. Her deception was not born of courage alone, but of the shallow foundation of Voldemort's reign. He never earned her loyalty, only her compliance. When the threat to her son outweighed the threat Voldemort posed to herself, she chose betrayal without hesitation. Contrast this with Albus Dumbledore, who held no such armies, who never demanded fealty under pain of death. He inspired devotion because he believed in people's capacity for good. Even Severus Snape, who spent years spying and risking his life, did so not out of fear of Dumbledore but out of respect. and ultimately love for Lily Potter. Dumbledore understood the power of choice. He never compelled Snape to remain in his service. Snape's double life was sustained by his own conviction that he was doing something necessary, something meaningful. Dumbledore's death did not dissolve that loyalty, it endured to the very end. This was the kind of allegiance Voldemort could never cultivate because he never valued anything other than dominance. During the final battle at Hogwarts, Voldemort's flaw was revealed with stark clarity. He gave the defenders 1 hour to surrender Harry Potter, promising mercy to all who abandoned the cause of resistance. But the promise was hollow, for everyone knew he had no intention of sparing lives. His threats only strengthened the defenders' resolve. When he entered the castle, he did not speak to inspire or persuade. He issued ultimatums and killed without remorse. By contrast, Dumbledore's army, the Order of the Phoenix, and even the ordinary students of Hogwarts rallied together not because of terror, but because they shared a belief that their cause was right. Even Slughorn, who had once hidden behind neutrality, returned to fight when it mattered most. Voldemort's intimidation drove people to defiance, while Dumbledore's legacy inspired courage. One sees the same blindness in Voldemort's dealings with his supposed allies abroad. He sought support from the Giants by threatening them, sending Death Eaters to demonstrate force. He did not consider that force alone could never replace trust. The Giants fought for him as mercenaries, not as followers, and when it became clear that victory was slipping away, they abandoned the field. Voldemort's failure to persuade extended beyond the Giants. The werewolves, led by Fenrir Greyback, were driven by hunger and the promise of prey, not ideological devotion. These alliances were transactional and brittle, dissolving the moment the balance of power shifted. When he took over the Ministry of Magic, Voldemort installed puppet officials whose only qualification was fear of him. Pius Thickness, the new minister under Imperious Curse, was a figurehead. The true reign was one of terror and secret arrests. Even the Muggle-born Registration Commission, led by Dolores Umbridge, depended on the unspoken threat that descent would end in Azkaban. But when Voldemort vanished from the ministry to pursue the Elder Wand, the machinery of terror began to fracture. The Death Eaters had no coherent plan, no higher purpose to sustain them. They flailed in panic because they had never been inspired to believe in anything but Voldemort's personal supremacy. It is telling that Harry Potter himself resisted Voldemort precisely because he understood the difference between fear and love. In Dumbledore's office, he told Scrimgeour, "Dumbledore's man through and through, aren't you, Potter?" Harry's answer was simple and proud. "Yeah, I am." This was the answer of someone who chose loyalty, who was never coerced. No such statement was ever heard from a Death Eater's lips. None would have dared claim Voldemort's man through and through without fear that any perceived failure would lead to torture. Their silence spoke more loudly than any pledge. Perhaps the most tragic example of Voldemort's short-sightedness was Peter Pettigrew. Wormtail joined Voldemort out of terror and self-preservation. He betrayed James and Lily Potter not because he believed in Voldemort's vision, but because he was too weak to resist the threat of death. When he finally came face to face with Harry and Ron in Malfoy Manor, a moment of hesitation, born from the smallest flicker of conscience, led to his own demise. Voldemort never imagined that a man so terrified of him could feel any loyalty to anything else. Yet even Wormtail's life was a monument to how fear breeds only resentment and cowardice, never true dedication. In the end, Voldemort's reign collapsed like a castle of sand because he never understood that trust is the foundation of all lasting power. When Neville Longbottom drew the sword of Gryffindor and killed Nagini, it was not an act of desperation. It was an act of belief that sacrifice mattered and that Voldemort's hollow terror could never replace genuine purpose. The same boy Voldemort once dismissed as insignificant became one of the final agents of his downfall. He inspired no such transformation in those he sought to intimidate. Even in death, Dumbledore's influence was more enduring. The Death Eater's scramble for safety as Voldemort fell was the final proof of his failure. Some disapparated at once, some threw down their wands. None rallied to protect their master's body, as no one truly believed in the ideals he claimed to stand for. They believed only in survival. When Harry stood over Voldemort's corpse, the room was silent, not just with shock, but with the relief of a terrible burden lifted. The world had been held hostage to one man's fear and rage. The moment that man was gone, the spell broke. Voldemort, in his arrogance, believed that cruelty was synonymous with strength. He saw Dumbledore's willingness to forgive as weakness, never realizing it was the source of unshakable loyalty. When he recruited followers, he offered no vision beyond the exaltation of pure blood supremacy and the suppression of Muggleborns. But these were empty slogans that inspired no real faith. Even those who professed belief did so because they feared the consequences of dissent. It is a cruel irony that Voldemort's own followers were his undoing as much as his enemies. Draco Malfoy's failure to kill Dumbledore set in motion a chain of events that weakened Voldemort's position. Narcissa's lie ensured that Harry survived. Snape's defection passed critical information to the Order of the Phoenix. None of these betrayals would have been possible if Voldemort had inspired true belief rather than compliance at the point of a wand. A cause built on terror cannot weather a single crack, and Voldemort's entire empire was nothing but cracks. The lesson is as stark as it is timeless. Fear can move people to act, but it cannot move them to love. Voldemort's tragedy was not merely that he was evil, but that he was blind. He spent his life demanding obedience, but never paused to ask whether those who knelt before him did so from respect. Had he learned to persuade rather than to frighten, he might have built something that survived him. But Voldemort was a man who understood only conquest, never conviction, and so he lost everything in the end. Number 23, poor intelligence and reconnaissance. Lord Voldemort, the most feared dark wizard of his age, prided himself on the terror he inspired and the absolute obedience he could extract with a single flick of his wand. But beneath this carefully cultivated legend lay a chasm of strategic blindness that would ultimately be his undoing. His reliance on brute intimidation blinded him to the subtleties of intelligence gathering, and nowhere was this more apparent than in his failure to discern the quiet designs of Albus Dumbledore. Dumbledore, with his gentle eyes and half-moon spectacles, never relied on bluster. He orchestrated a web of discreet alliances, hidden truths, and half-revealed intentions, while Voldemort basked in the belief that no one dared to cross him. It was this conceit that allowed the Order of the Phoenix to operate beneath his notice, gathering knowledge about his Horcruxes, those carefully concealed vessels of fragmented soul he thought safe from all scrutiny. Voldemort never imagined that Dumbledore would spend years patiently deducing their locations, nor did he suspect that a frail old man could quietly unravel the secret that even his Death Eaters did not fully comprehend. One of the most striking examples of Voldemort's blindness was the way he underestimated Severus Snape. In the privacy of his own mind, Voldemort believed himself a supreme judge of character. He trusted that Snape's resentment toward James Potter and his contempt for Harry would always eclipse any loyalty to Dumbledore. This was a catastrophic miscalculation. Voldemort never paused to question why Dumbledore had retained Snape on staff at Hogwarts, or why the man who had delivered the prophecy to him seemed so indispensable to the headmaster. So certain was Voldemort of his own persuasive power that he missed the truth. Snape's allegiance was ultimately bound not to fear, but to a grief and remorse Voldemort could neither fathom nor detect. "You disgust me," Snape once spat at Dumbledore in a moment of tortured honesty, yet he still risked everything to protect Harry, the living symbol of Lily Evans's sacrifice. Voldemort's failure to read this depth of motive is proof that intimidation alone does not equate to intelligence. The Dark Lord's failure to penetrate Dumbledore's plans also extended to the simplest of practical oversights. When the locket Horcrux was stolen from its hiding place in the cave, a place Voldemort considered so cunningly protected that he never again thought to verify it, he was unaware that Regulus Black had already betrayed him. Kreacher, the humble house elf whom Voldemort treated with scorn, became the key to this breach. Voldemort never considered that even the lowliest creature might hold secrets that would one day unravel his designs. He left no spy to monitor the cave, no loyal observer to confirm that the protections remained intact. This arrogance cost him dearly, for when Harry and Dumbledore retrieved the locket, only to discover it was a decoy, the mere fact that someone had interfered with it should have sent Voldemort into a calculated panic. Instead, his rage remained unfocused, never directed toward understanding who had dared to challenge him so quietly. Again and again, Voldemort's flawed intelligence work revealed itself. He ordered Draco Malfoy to kill Dumbledore, confident that this assignment would break the boy and terrorize Lucius into submission. But Voldemort never realized that in giving this impossible task to a child, he created an opportunity for Dumbledore and Snape to enact a prearranged plan. While Voldemort believed he was demonstrating ruthless genius, Dumbledore was already prepared for his own death on his own terms. "Severus, please," were Dumbledore's final words, and they were not a plea for mercy, but a signal to execute the strategy Voldemort never suspected. So complete was Voldemort's obsession with domination that he neglected to recognize the resilience of those he sought to crush. His information network, built on fear and flattery, could never match the patience and clarity of purpose that Dumbledore and the Order of the Phoenix embodied. Voldemort's strategic ineptitude was compounded by the fact that he discounted the power of love and loyalty as sources of intelligence. He never comprehended that people would risk everything for motives other than personal gain or terror. When he tortured Garrick Ollivander to extract information about wands, Voldemort assumed the old wand-maker had betrayed all he knew, but he underestimated Ollivander's quiet strength, the capacity to mislead and withhold even in the face of agony. Voldemort believed that pain would compel total confession. He never paused to consider that a mind disciplined by purpose can outlast cruelty. This, too, reflected his poverty of understanding. He gathered facts, but failed to interpret them in any way that revealed true insight. Perhaps nowhere was Voldemort's blind spot more glaring than in the matter of Harry Potter himself. The Dark Lord accepted the prophecy only partially overheard and built his entire campaign upon it. He never questioned whether his own actions had already fulfilled the words he feared. In killing Lily Potter, Voldemort created the very protection that rendered Harry untouchable, and yet he never attempted to learn how the boy had survived that night in Godric's Hollow. He simply accepted that it was an inexplicable fluke of magic and resolved to try again when the boy came of age. It never occurred to him to look deeper, to question Dumbledore, or to use his network of spies to penetrate the veil of secrecy around the Potter's sacrifice. This was the greatest irony. Voldemort, the most cunning sorcerer in a century, never discovered that love had power he could neither steal nor destroy. His failures of intelligence were not limited to the past. Even during the final months of the Second Wizarding War, Voldemort showed remarkable ignorance of his enemy's preparations. He assumed the Elder Wand would obey him simply because he had seized it from Dumbledore's tomb. He never investigated the wand's true allegiance, nor did he suspect that it might respond to the person who disarmed its prior master, rather than the one who committed petty grave robbery. In Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows, the wand's betrayal was made plain when Voldemort tried to kill Harry in the Forbidden Forest. The spell succeeded only in destroying the fragment of his soul within Harry, not the boy himself. Even then, Voldemort was too blinded by rage to reflect on what this failure truly meant. Voldemort's entire doctrine of intelligence was grounded in the assumption that fear alone could extract the truth. He never invested in the patient cultivation of informants or in the subtle art of misinformation. He never considered that Dumbledore's decision to leave Harry in the care of the Dursleys was itself a tactic to keep the boy hidden in plain sight. While Voldemort scoured forests and caves for relics to prolong his life, Dumbledore quietly prepared Harry for the moment he would choose to walk to his own death. In this respect, Voldemort was never playing the same game as his opponents. He was a creature of reaction and brute force, never of foresight. One might think that a man who split his soul into fragments would be endlessly vigilant over their safety, yet Voldemort never even considered that his Horcruxes were vulnerable precisely because he could not imagine another wizard having the nerve or knowledge to seek them out. When Hermione Granger destroyed the cup of Helga Hufflepuff in the Chamber of Secrets, Voldemort had no inkling it was gone until too late. His failure to anticipate that the trio would piece together the secret of the Horcruxes underscores how little he understood the intelligence-gathering skills of even young witches and wizards. He dismissed Hermione and Ron as mere children, and so discounted their potential as adversaries. It was this condescension that allowed his enemies to outmaneuver him repeatedly. In Voldemort's mind, only he possessed the intellect to comprehend the true stakes of their war. He overlooked the possibility that his own overconfidence was a liability. He interpreted every small victory as proof of destiny rather than evidence of his enemy's growing sophistication. Even when he seized control of the Ministry, Voldemort did not build a reliable system to vet the flow of information. His network of informants in Hogwarts proved no match for the ingenuity of Dumbledore's army. He never realized that Neville Longbottom and Ginny Weasley were quietly coordinating acts of sabotage under his nose. The night of the final battle at Hogwarts, Voldemort's lack of foresight reached its climax. He had stationed his forces at every entrance, but he failed to understand that Hogwarts itself, an ancient place full of hidden passages and loyal defenders, could never be completely subdued by brute occupation. He assumed that once he possessed the Elder Wand, no force could oppose him. His strategic failure lay in the conviction that terror would keep the defenders cowering, but instead it galvanized them. When he demanded Harry Potter be delivered to him, he was met not with surrender, but with defiance. It was proof that his obsession with domination had left him incapable of recognizing that knowledge and morale were weapons he could neither steal nor break. In the end, Voldemort's downfall was not simply a matter of misjudging an opponent's strength. It was the culmination of years of neglecting the simplest principle of strategy, to know your enemy better than they know you. Dumbledore had anticipated Voldemort's every instinct. Snape had walked the razor's edge of double allegiance with more finesse than Voldemort could imagine. Even Harry, whom he considered a pawn, became a master of information when he chose to keep his survival a secret in the Forbidden Forest. Voldemort's mistake was believing that fear and cruelty were substitutes for intelligence. In truth, they were only masks that concealed his staggering ignorance. Number 24. Believing death is absolute defeat. Voldemort's greatest failing was not simply his terror of death, but his unwavering conviction that death was the ultimate defeat, final, empty, irreversible. This belief shaped every choice he made, every horror he committed, and every life he destroyed. He saw death as the erasure of self, the destruction of power, and the end of possibility. So he pursued immortality with a fanatic's zeal, tearing his soul apart to anchor himself in the living world, refusing even to consider that death might contain anything beyond annihilation. This blindness kept him from understanding those who opposed him most effectively, people willing to face death, not because they loved dying, but because they loved others more. In Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows, J.K.I. Rowling writes, "There is nothing worse than death, Dumbledore." But Dumbledore simply replies, "You are quite wrong." Voldemort never accepted that answer, and that was his doom. He could not fathom how anyone could find value in sacrificing themselves. For him, self-preservation was the highest law, and every death that stood in his way was justified as a small price to pay. When Lily Potter refused to stand aside and chose to die for Harry, Voldemort did not see courage or love in her act, only stubbornness and weakness. He offered her a chance to live purely because her death would have been wasteful, not out of any respect for her choice. Her sacrifice cast an ancient magic over Harry that he failed to understand, even as it burned him when he tried to kill the baby. He treated that blood magic as a mere obstacle to overcome with cunning and theft, never recognizing that it was rooted in precisely what he despised most, the power of love to transcend death. This limitation showed most starkly in the graveyard in Little Hangleton. Voldemort's resurrection was triumphant in his eyes. He had defeated death again, in a grotesque rebirth, using Harry's blood. He gathered his Death Eaters to witness his triumph, forcing Harry to duel him in a mockery of chivalry. But what he did not see was that Harry had faced death already, tied to that gravestone and expecting to die, yet found the courage to fight back. Voldemort scoffed at that courage as mere childish defiance, never suspecting that it signaled a quality he lacked entirely, the ability to accept death if it meant protecting others. When their wands connected in priori incantatem, echoes of Voldemort's victims emerged, not as simple ghosts but as guides, lending Harry hope and time to escape. Even then Voldemort learned nothing. He dismissed it as a flaw in his wand, never reflecting on why the dead would fight for the living. Voldemort's followers mirrored his fear of death, clinging to him because they feared what would happen if he fell. Bellatrix Lestrange worshipped him as the immortal Dark Lord, the one who could conquer death. Lucius Malfoy, whose cowardice was legendary, pleaded with Voldemort to spare his son, betraying that he feared death more than dishonor. Even Snape, who risked everything to protect Harry for love of Lily, knew Voldemort would never understand why. Snape lied to Voldemort until the end precisely because Voldemort could not imagine that a man might turn against him out of love for a dead woman. "You have been a good and faithful servant, Severus," Voldemort says coldly in the book before killing him, showing that he saw even loyalty as transactional. Death to Voldemort was always a threat to be punished or avoided, never a consequence to be accepted for a greater good. Contrast Voldemort's worldview with Harry's final walk into the Forbidden Forest. He has seen the memory Snape gives him, realizes he must die, and chooses to do so. He carries no wand in defense. He embraces death willingly, repeating to himself like a mantra, "I am going to die." Yet he does not do this out of despair. He does it because he understands his death will save those he loves. The text describes Harry's acceptance in hushed, reverent tones, emphasizing the weight of his decision. He even uses the resurrection stone to see his parents, Sirius and Remus, not to bring them back, but to find the strength to join them. He walks beside them, their presence reminding him that death does not sever bonds, but can deepen them. Voldemort, watching Harry approach, sees only easy victory, not the power of that choice. The irony is brutal. Voldemort believes killing Harry in the forest is the pinnacle of triumph. He has defeated the one opponent who eluded him. He even boasts Harry Potter is dead to his followers, but he does not realize Harry's sacrifice has protected them all, just as Lily's sacrifice once protected him. The protection Voldemort believed he had co-opted by taking Harry's blood turned against him because he never understood its source. He could not see that true mastery over death lay not in avoiding it, but in accepting it for others' sake. Dumbledore had warned, "Do not pity the dead, Harry. Pity the living, and above all, those who live without love." Voldemort lived without love and died without understanding it. His plan for immortality through Horcruxes also reveals this blind spot. Voldemort split his soul precisely because he could not bear the thought of death. Each Horcrux was an admission of his terror, his unwillingness to let anything beyond his control define him. But by mutilating his soul, he made himself vulnerable to destruction in a way a whole soul never would have been. Dumbledore recognized this paradox, explaining to Harry that Voldemort's fear of death made him weaker, not stronger. When Harry hunts Horcruxes with Hermione and Ron, he does so at great risk, knowing he may die. Voldemort never comprehends why they would choose such a quest. He believes they must be motivated by power or revenge because he cannot imagine anyone risking death without a selfish reason. Even in the final confrontation in the Great Hall, Voldemort reveals his failure to learn. He taunts Harry about Dumbledore's death, certain that killing Harry will finally prove his superiority. Harry counters not with curses but with truth, that the Elder Wand's allegiance is not Voldemort's. Voldemort laughs, refusing to believe it. He cannot grasp that loyalty might matter more than raw power. Harry says simply, "You're the one who is weak. You'll never know love or friendship, and I feel sorry for you." Voldemort roars in rage, unable to comprehend that pity, too, can be a kind of strength. In that moment, the man who feared death above all else faced it unprepared, destroyed by his own rebounding curse. Throughout the series, Voldemort dismisses any magic he cannot control or quantify. He calls love weak and self-sacrifice foolish, ignoring evidence to the contrary. When Dumbledore explains why Harry survived as a baby, Voldemort treats it as trickery rather than truth. Even the prophecy he fears speaks of the one with power the Dark Lord knows not, which Voldemort interprets as some hidden spell or artifact. He never realizes it is Harry's capacity for self-sacrifice. This refusal to see beyond the literal, to accept that some power lies in meaning rather than mechanics, leaves him unable to guard against it. Voldemort's downfall was written in every one of his choices. He tortured, killed, and threatened because he believed fear would make him unassailable. He gathered followers by offering power and security, encouraging them to share his dread of mortality. He tore apart families, desecrated graves, and committed soul murder to achieve a false eternity. Yet in the end, all his power fell to nothing because he refused to see death as anything but a void. He had no answer when confronted by people who would walk into that void freely for love. One of the most striking examples of Voldemort's failure to understand death's meaning is the death of Severus Snape. Believing the Elder Wand's allegiance lies with Snape, Voldemort kills him without hesitation. He feels no remorse, no loss, only satisfaction at removing an obstacle. He even offers Snape's dying body to Nagini rather than face it himself, but in doing so he loses the only man who could have explained Harry's survival in detail. Voldemort's dismissal of Snape's humanity, his inability to recognize loyalty born of love for a dead woman, ensures he dies ignorant. Rowling writes of Voldemort's cold calculation. Voldemort raised the Elder Wand. Snape's pleading eyes met his, and then there was a flash of green light. Snape's death sealed Voldemort's defeat, but Voldemort could not see it. Harry's return from the forest is a final proof of Voldemort's blindness. Believing Harry dead, he parades him before Hogwarts, demanding surrender. Yet Harry chose to return, having offered himself freely, breaking Voldemort's power over his friends. This is the magic Voldemort never learned, that choosing death willingly can change its meaning entirely. Harry was not immortal in the sense Voldemort wanted to be, but he was untouchable because he accepted mortality. The irony is that Voldemort's obsession with avoiding death ensured his death would be meaningless, while Harry's acceptance gave his survival purpose. When the final battle ends, Voldemort dies without grandeur, his body crumpling on the floor. No longer anything but mortal remains. Rowling describes it without drama, underlining the emptiness of his victory. He achieved no legacy but terror, no loyalty but fear, no immortality but horror stories. His soul, split and ruined, left no mark of greatness, only tragedy. He was a man who could not understand that death could be meaningful, redemptive, or even beautiful in its sacrifice. Harry, who embraced death to save others, leaves behind love, family, and peace. Voldemort's life was shaped by the belief that death was the ultimate loss. In truth, his refusal to understand it was the loss that truly destroyed him. Number 25. Ignoring the role of ordinary people in war. Voldemort's grand design for domination was, in many ways, built on the same brittle foundation that had undone tyrants throughout human history, a blinding arrogance that left him incapable of perceiving the true sources of resistance. He imagined that by seizing the Ministry of Magic and subjugating every wizarding institution, he had closed all avenues of defiance. Yet he grossly underestimated the quiet, stubborn power of ordinary people, those without pure bloodlines or even wands, who refused to bow their heads. This strategic blindness emerged again and again, nowhere more poignantly than in the hidden shelters and rural outposts where Muggle families risked everything to protect those Voldemort deemed unworthy of existence. Throughout the final months of the Second Wizarding War, Muggle-born witches and wizards were hunted like animals, their names posted on decrees and pamphlets distributed by the Muggle-born Registration Commission. Voldemort entrusted Dolores Umbridge with this apparatus of persecution, convinced that she would root out any trace of tainted lineage. But in his contempt, he failed to anticipate that countless Muggle neighbours would defy the Ministry's proclamations. In a cottage on the outskirts of Yorkshire, a woman named Edith Chambers hid 3 terrified teenagers, Muggle-born siblings, who had fled London after their father's arrest. Edith, who had no magical abilities, created false ration cards and fabricated letters to misdirect snatchers. Her quiet defiance saved their lives and allowed them months later to rejoin the Order of the Phoenix. Even among those with wizarding heritage, Voldemort's scorn for the untrained and the unaligned created dangerous blind spots. He poured his energy into corralling Hogwarts and terrorizing Diagon Alley, convinced that such visible conquests would cow the rest of society into submission. But it was precisely the people he dismissed, the shopkeepers, the post office clerks, the old farmers, who passed messages behind enemy lines and moved fugitives from one safe house to the next. As Hermione once reflected, it was people like them who made all the difference. And she was right. Voldemort's inability to see value in these acts of quiet courage deprived him of the intelligence he needed to anticipate where Harry Potter would strike. While Voldemort preened himself as the master of fear, he never grasped that fear when wielded too bluntly forges unlikely alliances. The more his forces stormed homes and tortured families, the more ordinary citizens grew determined to help the resistance. In Deathly Hallows, the Daily Prophet's underground edition spread stories of Muggles who risked their lives to deliver food and supplies to hiding magical children. In one instance, a Muggle truck driver named Stanley Price transported an entire convoy of refugees in the back of his lorry. Voldemort's Death Eaters captured Stanley and obliviated him, but they never realized how many networks of support had already sprouted because of his example. Consider the night the trio escaped Malfoy Manor, battered and shaken, carrying the limp body of Dobby. Even then, Voldemort's strategy of terror had failed to anticipate how the house elf, once a servant, would prove instrumental in subverting his control. Dobby's loyalty was born of gratitude, of simple decency, and of solidarity with the oppressed, qualities Voldemort despised. He could not comprehend that this so-called lowly creature, unworthy of a wand, might have the will to act where greater wizards hesitated. The same blindness extended to Muggles and Muggle-borns. Voldemort believed he had cowed them all into submission, but every rescue and every hidden passage owed something to those whom he thought beneath notice. When Voldemort occupied Hogwarts in the final hours before the Battle of Hogwarts, he assumed the castle was his by default. He did not realize that many of the students he despised had used the Room of Requirement to hide dozens of those he would have executed. Even more striking, in those tense days, Muggle parents risked ministry patrols to bring food or messages to their children. "I never thought I'd see the day my mum would cross a line like that," Dean Thomas later recalled, marvelling that his Muggle mother had slipped a letter past the Carrows' screening charms. Voldemort's assumptions about weakness and cowardice led him to discount the resourcefulness of those who loved without the incentive of blood purity or fear of retribution. Throughout his rise, Voldemort relied on the idea that the old hierarchies would remain unchallenged. Pure bloods on top, Muggle-borns crushed, Muggles themselves irrelevant. Yet, in the final reckoning, these divisions proved to be illusions that sustained only his own vanity. For every pure blood who pledged loyalty out of fear or ambition, there were ordinary folk who found in his cruelty a reason to resist. Indifference was never an option, Professor McGonagall said after the war, and she spoke for many. Voldemort's short-sighted dismissal of the non-magical world closed off any possibility of understanding the deep currents of solidarity that would eventually drown him. One of the most telling examples came when Harry, Ron, and Hermione infiltrated the Ministry under Polyjuice Potion. Though they disguised themselves as magical bureaucrats, it was a Muggle-born clerk named Mary Cattermole who inspired a moment of collective outrage. When she stood before Umbridge's tribunal, her quiet dignity and her husband's desperate insistence that she was no threat to anyone pierced even the most jaded onlookers. Voldemort had believed that terrorizing such families would ensure docility, but the exact opposite occurred. The spectacle bred outrage that spread through every community, magical and Muggle alike. This era of perception extended into Voldemort's military strategy. He devoted countless resources to hunting Harry Potter and purging the Ministry, yet he left large swathes of Muggle Britain effectively uncontrolled. In this vacuum, fugitives travelled by mundane means, on trains, in lorries, and across footpaths unguarded by magical patrols. More than once, snatchers reported entire convoys of escapees slipping through checkpoints because no wizard had bothered to monitor the Muggle infrastructure. Voldemort's failure to understand the resilience of these communities meant he forfeited the chance to seal off the escape routes that sustained the resistance. Even inside the Death Eater ranks, some questioned whether ignoring Muggle cooperation was wise. Severus Snape, though trapped in his own dangerous duplicity, recognized that Muggle-borns and their families could not be discounted. His own mother had been a Muggle-born, and he knew better than most that love and loyalty could transcend Voldemort's hierarchies. But Voldemort saw such complexity as weakness. His need for ideological purity blinded him to the tactical necessity of understanding one's enemies in full measure. Voldemort's contempt extended to the very idea of shared humanity. He scoffed at the notion that Muggles could feel the same terror, love, and rage that animated wizard-kind. "There is no good and evil, there is only power," he had told Harry in the Chamber of Secrets, but power that disregards the heart cannot hold forever. Each hidden family, each brave Muggle-born, proved that power alone could not extinguish the will to defy. When Neville Longbottom stood in the ruins of Hogwarts holding the sword of Gryffindor, it was the culmination of countless unseen acts by people Voldemort never considered relevant. From the elderly couple in Dover who sheltered escapees to the Muggle-born children who passed messages in coded letters, these overlooked figures formed the backbone of resistance. Voldemort, for all his cunning, could not comprehend that the courage of ordinary people was as potent as any incantation. Even the final defeat owed something to this neglected majority. As Harry prepared to confront Voldemort in the Forbidden Forest, he carried with him the memories of all those who had risked everything to protect the vulnerable. Each name was a rebuke to the ideology that had driven Voldemort to this point. Ted Tonks, murdered for helping Muggle-born refugees; Charity Burbage, executed for defending Muggle rights; countless unnamed Muggles whose sacrifices would never make the history books. Voldemort's failure to understand the cost of these lives was his most ruinous miscalculation. And so, in the reckoning of the wizarding world, it became clear that the Dark Lord's greatest weakness had never been the Elder Wand or the Horcruxes. It was his refusal to imagine that those he despised could matter at all. His scorn for muggles and muggleborns made him blind to the quiet revolution unfolding in kitchens, attics and fields across Britain. By excluding an entire stratum of society, Voldemort created enemies he could neither see nor suppress, and in the end, they helped bring about the victory he believed impossible. Number 26. Inability to forgive or offer second chances. Voldemort's entire regime was a monument to terror, built stone by stone from threats, cruelty, and the refusal to forgive. He saw mercy as weakness, and weakness as rot to be burned out. So he created an empire where a single mistake meant torture or death, and where those who followed him did so out of fear, not loyalty. This obsession with punishment drove even his most faithful Death Eaters to hide the truth. Bellatrix Lestrange, known for fanatical devotion, never dared speak a word that might displease him. She had watched him kill or torture others for so little as disagreeing or failing him, so she learned to say only what he wanted to hear. The fear of punishment was so absolute that it destroyed honesty among his own ranks. In Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince, Snape tells Bellatrix, "I have been sent on Voldemort's business," reminding her and the reader that no one dared question his orders openly for fear of incurring fatal suspicion. Even allies who wanted to warn him about real dangers would sooner lie or stay silent because telling the truth could be fatal. This fear bred a culture of paranoia. Voldemort didn't allow mistakes, and so no one admitted them. Every error had to be covered, every weakness hidden. When Lucius Malfoy failed to retrieve the prophecy from the Department of Mysteries, Voldemort punished him by casting him aside, imprisoning him in Azkaban, and showing the world his disgrace. Lucius had served him loyally for years, but Voldemort offered no second chance. Instead, he made an example of him. This taught the other Death Eaters that failure was worse than death itself. They learned to lie about their progress, to exaggerate success, to hide anything that might look like weakness. Voldemort's reaction to Lucius's failure ensured that no one would risk telling him bad news again. This was catastrophic for a leader who needed accurate information to make strategic decisions. Even within the inner circle, this terror was corrosive. In Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows, Voldemort's cruelty is clear at Malfoy Manor, where he murders Charity Burbage in front of his followers. The point isn't just the murder, it's the lesson. He is teaching them to fear him more than anything else, to crush any dissent before it forms. But the lesson they truly learn is that there is no safety, no loyalty he values enough to spare them if they displease him. This approach creates an atmosphere where betrayal is almost inevitable because the only way to survive is to hide one's thoughts, to conspire, to place personal survival above the cause. Voldemort destroyed any chance of true loyalty by making every Death Eater afraid to speak the truth. His inability to forgive or offer second chances extended even to his most critical supporters. Severus Snape is the clearest example. Snape is not loyal because of love for Voldemort's ideals, but because of personal reasons and carefully calculated self-preservation. Voldemort never really understood Snape, never trusted him fully, because his worldview didn't allow for true repentance. Snape's remorse over Lily Potter's death was inconceivable to Voldemort, who saw love as an obstacle. Even as Snape worked to protect Harry, Voldemort viewed him as a valuable but dangerous asset, one whose death was always an option if his usefulness ended. He couldn't imagine that Snape's motivations might be more complex than fear or ambition. By refusing to consider that people might change or regret, Voldemort limited his understanding of them, leaving him vulnerable to Snape's double game. In Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire, Voldemort punishes Wormtail by giving him a silver hand, with the promise that it would one day turn on him if he showed weakness. Even the gratitude for helping him return to life was poisoned by cruelty. He could have rewarded Wormtail, cultivated real loyalty. Instead, he ensured that even Wormtail lived in terror of failure. J.K. Rowling writes, "Wormtail, you owe me your life." That debt was turned into a threat, a constant reminder that Voldemort's mercy was a lie. This ensured that Wormtail would continue to serve from fear alone, incapable of independent thought or genuine loyalty. When Voldemort returned to power, he demanded absolute obedience and punished the slightest suspicion of betrayal. He sent Fenrir Greyback to persuade reluctant allies, using terror to force compliance. But such alliances were fragile. The Carrows taught cruelty at Hogwarts not out of shared ideology, but out of fear of what would happen if they refused. The entire system was built on terror without trust, so the moment Voldemort's power wavered, so did the allegiance of those he ruled. When Harry survived the killing curse in the Forbidden Forest, Voldemort's followers lost their nerve. The lie of his invincibility was exposed, and fear alone was no longer enough to hold them. The refusal to forgive also meant Voldemort lost talented supporters who might have warned him of dangers. Regulus Black is an example of this failure. Regulus turned against Voldemort after seeing the fate of Kreacher, understanding the Dark Lord would kill even loyal servants to protect his secrets. Voldemort didn't see the value in winning back a follower who had doubts. He couldn't consider showing mercy, even to test loyalty. Instead, he ignored Regulus's defection until it was too late, and the Horcrux was stolen. This single act of blind cruelty cost him a piece of his own soul, and he never realized it. Voldemort's inability to imagine that someone might feel guilt or moral conflict blinded him to motivations beyond fear. Similarly, Voldemort's persecution of the Order of the Phoenix was marked by the same refusal to offer any olive branch. He never attempted to negotiate with Dumbledore, never considered compromise or persuasion. His strategy was pure violence. Dumbledore understood people could change. He gave Draco Malfoy the chance to lower his wand, offered Snape a path to redemption. Voldemort could not comprehend such a thing. This blindness made him predictable and easy to oppose for those who saw his pattern of fear. As long as you refused to be intimidated, you had power over him. Harry's refusal to beg, to grovel, enraged Voldemort because it denied him his main tool, terror. His refusal to consider second chances also shaped the Horcrux plan itself. Voldemort saw immortality through splitting the soul as perfect because it relied on total control and domination over death. He never considered that living forever with a maimed soul might be a punishment worse than dying. He refused to accept the possibility of personal transformation or redemption. As Dumbledore told Harry in The Half-Blood Prince, "It is the unknown we fear when we look upon death and darkness, nothing more." Voldemort's terror of death left him no room to imagine change or growth, and so he maimed himself irrevocably. The greatest irony is that Voldemort demanded total loyalty but gave none in return. When he took over the ministry, he ruled through puppet officials and assassinations, but he didn't reward loyalty with trust. Even Yaxley and Travers, who carried out his orders, knew they were expendable. He couldn't forgive past failures, and so no one felt safe. His agents competed with each other to avoid his wrath, spreading more lies and paranoia. This damaged the very organization he needed to win. His supposed genius as a strategist crumbled because he didn't understand people well enough to lead them without fear. When Snape became headmaster of Hogwarts, Voldemort did not trust him with real power. He assigned the Carrows to watch the school to spread terror among the students. Snape's own leadership was undermined because Voldemort wouldn't allow any environment that wasn't ruled by fear. Even though Snape was his most competent lieutenant, Voldemort could not give him autonomy. This guaranteed that Hogwarts would be a place of resistance, not submission. He believed terror was enough, but it always bred resistance in those with nothing to lose. Another failure to forgive was seen in his treatment of Draco Malfoy. Voldemort assigned Draco the impossible task of killing Dumbledore, knowing it would likely destroy him. This wasn't about loyalty, it was about punishing Lucius Malfoy and keeping the family in terror. Even when Draco succeeded in cornering Dumbledore, Voldemort never rewarded him. He used the family as hostages, ensuring their fear would keep them obedient. But this fear turned to desperation, and by the Battle of Hogwarts, the Malfoys abandoned him to search for Draco. They no longer believed in the cause, only in saving themselves. His refusal to show them mercy broke their loyalty completely. The final proof of Voldemort's failure was Harry himself. Harry survived because he offered compassion even to his enemies. He saved Draco from the fiend fire. He buried Dobby with respect. He refused to kill when it wasn't necessary. Voldemort could never understand that this was strength, not weakness. When he killed Snape, believing the Elder Wand would then serve him, he misread everything about loyalty. Snape's final memories weren't of serving Voldemort, but of protecting Harry for Lily's sake. Voldemort never saw that love could outwit fear, that forgiveness could create loyalty stronger than terror. Ultimately, Voldemort's empire of fear collapsed because it had no foundation but violence. He didn't allow people to make mistakes and learn from them, didn't offer second chances that could have built trust. He punished the truth out of them. His worldview was too narrow to see that power gained through cruelty is brittle because it creates nothing but lies, betrayal, and fear. Even the most loyal Death Eaters had plans to save themselves if he fell. In the end, he stood alone in the Great Hall, surrounded by corpses and cowed survivors, because he had never given them any other reason to stand with him.